This episode is brought to you by Buffalo Trace Distillery. Powerful yet smooth. Contained but never tame. Proudly going their own way, but never going alone. This is the spirit inside Buffalo Trace Bourbon. Made at Buffalo Trace Distillery, the world's most award-winning distillery. Buffalo Trace is always perfectly untamed. Distilled, aged, and bottled by Buffalo Trace Distillery, Franklin County, Kentucky. 90 proof, 45% alcohol by volume. Learn more at buffalotracedistillery.com. Please drink responsibly.
No matter how you travel, it's good to have a plan. Some people plan every minute. No sleep, bus, museum, another museum. While others only plan to take it day by day. When it comes to your finances, a plan is just as important. You can count on Credit Karma to give you the insights you need to understand your options, so you can take charge of your financial path and find your way to money. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on. Download the app today.
Hello, and welcome to episode 249 of Something About the Beatles. A very special one. I like to think of them all as being special, like your own children, but I think this one is special. First of all, you might detect a little bit of a head cold in my voice. That is true. But I would point out that returning guest, a Satby favorite, who I've been trying to get back on the show for a while, had a very good excuse due to illness for not being on in the last couple years. And that is being stricken with COVID very seriously. We're talking 102 days in intensive care. And just coming off in the U.S., the Thanksgiving holiday, I will tell you that one of the things I am most thankful and grateful for is having another opportunity to have a conversation with Ray Connolly. He is a journalist, writer, screenwriter of renown, as you well know. He has written the best Lennon biography in print as far as I'm concerned, Being John Lennon, A Restless Life, which was published a few years ago. He is also the author and collator of the Ray Connolly Beatles Archive, which is available in print and an ebook. I misspeak early on in the show about his website. It's rayconnolly.co.uk, not rayconnolly.com. But in any event, I'm momentarily sick, and he got through being sick miraculously, I would say. If you're interested at all in checking out his story of dealing with that, there's a great piece he wrote for The Guardian. Just Google Ray Connolly and COVID in 102, and you'll find it. It's linked on the Satby site. I've been wanting to have Ray Connolly back because he was a Beatles insider as a well-respected, accomplished journalist in the 1960s and 70s, and was part of their inner circle, was particularly close to John, having written the aforementioned book years later, which is what makes it so special. He was a highly qualified journalist as well as a friend and trusted insider to the Beatles, but John in particular. So that's what makes that particular biography of John worth reading. His Beatles archive of articles he wrote based on interviews and such during the Beatles' career in real time. Brilliant reporting. Some of it was not published at the time, but all of it's collected, and it's absolutely one of the essential Beatle reads as far as I'm concerned. So do check it out if you don't already own it. Anyway, I've been wanting to get Ray back on the show for any number of reasons, but for the nearly 2 hours that we talked in this conversation, we touched on a ton of things. And it ranges from, obvious, the go-to thing this year, the Get Back film, as well as more detailed reading on John. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up is, as you'd heard on the recent show with Robert Rosen, we talked about the spiking of the Peter Doggett book as well as the one by Mike Madero, Mike Tree, as John called him, the Lennon's gardener at the Dakota. And it reminded me of something that I'd been aware of for some time, which was that in the 80s, Ray, who had written the screenplays to the two films That'll Be the Day and Stardust, a sequel, the first one being that great star vehicle for Ringo back in 1973, and the follow-up, both of which starred David Essex. He began writing after John's death a story of the Beatles' rise from Liverpool and taking up through the audition, or at least the tryout session with George Martin in 1962. And it was called Working Class Hero, centering on John's story. Now, we know by this time we've seen a few treatments, notably Nowhere Boy from a few years ago. And anyway, Ray wrote this. It was to be directed by Michael Apted, who you may know from the 7-Up film series that I've talked about somewhere publicly. Those documentaries starting in 1964 on the group of kids and revisiting them every 7 years. He passed away a couple years ago, I believe, so obviously the series ended with him. But in any event, he was attached to this Working Class Hero film that had been green-lighted, was attached to Warner Brothers, and then got spiked. Now, there's reason to think that maybe it had to do with the competing David Wolper documentary at the time, but Ray goes a little further, and maybe you'll detect the pattern here running up until the present day with depictions of John's life that get blocked. In any event, that was the start of our conversation, but it goes through any number of topics along the way, including drug use, John's association with Michael X, and a bit on Paul in there as well. So, something for everyone. This was a very far-reaching conversation, and Ray is just a terrific, terrific conversationalist, very insightful guy. And this show will be reaching the world on his 82nd birthday, December 4th. He was a couple months younger than John. As he points out, they kind of experienced the same sort of cultural life and school life in Britain, which probably helped connect them the way they did connect. So check it out, see what you think, and let's all join in wishing Ray a happy birthday on his 82nd birthday. Hope to have him back again. I'd sent you the link to that article that Robert Rosen wrote about the two books, the Peter Doggett book and the other one by John Lennon's Gardener. And one of the things I was reminded of when I read that about these stories to come out about John that got spiked was your own Working Class Hero film script. And that was something you did all kinds of research on and talked to as many people as you could. You want to talk about that a little bit? It's available for anybody listening to this. If you go to rayconnolly.com, you've got the actual script that you wrote for a story that would have taken John Lennon from Liverpool right up through 1962. And it was a fantastic script. I would love to see it develop sometime. But you'd had it underway before it got blocked, right?
Yeah, we had it going. It wasn't my idea, actually. It was somebody else's idea. And they got Michael Apted to want to direct it. He'd done Stardust, which I also wrote. And we got David Putnam to produce it. So then I went off and did my research. And I went to Hamburg and I went to Liverpool and talked to Cynthia and talked to everyone I could think of. But, Bill Harry. I talked to Paul a lot, but, all these people. And met the people in Hamburg that John had met.
You talked to Horst Fascher in Hamburg?
Everything seemed great. I thought, oh, good, I'm going to make a really good film. And the film's going to end when they leave Liverpool. So there's a little group trying to get somewhere. And we went as far as the audition with George Martin, but we don't know what's going to happen. We see them going to Hamburg. We see them at school, how John meets Cynthia, his first wife, and all that. I was really pleased with it. I thought, did a good job here. You don't always do a good job. You're not always sure that what you've done is good enough, if you're honest with yourself. But for this, I thought, yeah, I did a pretty good job. I phoned Mimi, Auntie Mimi, who I'd never met, and I rang her up a couple of times and had long chats, and she was really helpful. And we were planning to meet. She said, come down, love, when it's a bit warmer, because she lives on the south coast. Come down when it's a bit warmer and we'll go out or something. So I said, okay, I'll come down. What I didn't do, and it's a big mistake, I should have talked to Yoko. And I thought, well, if I do, it'll get difficult because, she has a sort of way of getting in the way of things and lawyers will get involved. And I just imagined that she could be difficult, although it didn't concern her because she wasn't involved with John at that time. She hadn't met him.
Right. It's the pre-Beatlemania John Lennon.
Yeah. Hadn't met him, probably hadn't heard of him because she was never a Beatles fan anyway. I'll approach her last of all. I don't want to sort of find myself having to explain too much. And then one day I got a call from Yoko's new lover, Sam Havertoy, whom I'd met. And he was very aggressive. And he said, he was calling from New York, and he said, stop harassing Mimi. What? I'm not harassing anybody. And then he suddenly slammed the phone down. And I thought, well, he's being put up to this. Yoko's put him up to it.
How did he find out about Mimi? Do you know?
I think Mimi had rung Yoko, or they talked. And I think he mentioned that they talked. And Mimi said innocently, "What's this film that Ray Connolly's writing?"
Oh, boy.
Yoko didn't know about this. So it was my mistake. In a polite sense, I was very impolite. I hadn't thought to clear it with her first, but I think at the same time, well, she'll be a difficult one to get round. I mean, I could see it coming. I thought, well, pretty difficult. So I didn't. I thought, I'll do that last of all when I've got it all sorted. Then she can see I've done a good job and it doesn't sort of do anything to damage John's reputation or whatever.
Implicit in your not approaching her first, was there maybe some sort of thought that, well, if I bring her into it, she's going to want control? Yeah,
a bit of that. Yoko is a controlling woman. I mean, she just is. And that's not a criticism, although it probably is slightly. But, she's that sort of woman. She's a bit manipulative. And I just thought, well, I'll wait. But I thought, we'll do a good job, and then we'll see it. And then she'll say, oh, yeah, I really like this. We never got that far because at that time now, by this time, I think I'd more or less finished the script. And so we sent it off to Los Angeles, to Warner Brothers it was. And Michael Apps was very pleased with it, and I was very pleased, and David was pleased with it. I thought, oh, this is great. We're all back together again, going to make a really good film. And I went to see Lucy Fisher at Warner Brothers in California, Burbank, and she was very pleased and everything, and that's great. So I came home, went on holiday to Corsica probably, and came back 3 weeks later, and I got a call from Michael Apps this very first day. And he said, bad news, Raymond, the film's off. What? And he said, well, Warner's decided against it. There's some problem with Warner Television, that they're doing the same thing. And we've been the casualties. Now, at this time, Warner's had paid me quite a lot of money to do this, and Michael too. So they were heavily into it, but not massively into it. Films get cancelled all the time. You can hire a writer to do something, a director, and that's if maybe, I don't know, in total then maybe $100,000 or something. That's not a fortune when a film is going to cost 5 million or 10 million. In those days, these days it would be 50, but then, so it's not a fortune. So they're not throwing away a mountain of money, but it's still enough to think about. So that didn't happen. And I was really upset because I wanted to do it and get it right. I wanted to tell the story of these 4 boys in Liverpool and how their ambitions were quite low at that time. They didn't know what's going to happen. That thing about none of us know what the future is going to bring. And they didn't know what the future was going to be. They just knew what they could do and what they liked doing.
Was that gleaned from your own research, or did any of that read you had on them come from conversations you'd had through the years with them?
Oh, it would have been partly that. I mean, I wrote a film called That'll Be the Day, and we gave Ringo a part in it. So we spent quite a lot of time. And they were telling funny stories about what it was like in Liverpool. And I'd worked in Liverpool. I'd had a job. My first job was on a newspaper in Liverpool when I was just out of university. And I'd done interviews there. So I knew all the people they knew in Liverpool. People like Roger McGuff, the poet. And the first girl that John ever went out with, I talked to her. I talked to all these people.
Thelma Pickles, was that?
Thelma, yeah. Who then later married Roger, and who I'm still in touch with. And she still, when I was ill with COVID, she wrote to me and she said, I'm praying for you, when I was getting better, because at the time I was unconscious. But when I became conscious, I began to get emails. So Thelma and Pete Best, quite a few people. So the film just got cancelled, and I was upset, and it was a drag. Michael Apted did something else, and I did something else. But in a way, that wasn't the point. The point was it would have been a good film. Anyway, Yoko and I never really spoke again after that. Except, I'll tell you one funny story about this. We did talk again about 10 years ago. Being a freelance writer, I'm often short of money. You get a lot, then you get nothing at all. You get a lot, then you get nothing at all. But you get little, then, So that's the way it is, which I didn't have to be a freelancer. I chose it. Anyway, and I thought, I could do with some money. What have I got to sell? Maybe the furniture, or I don't want to sell furniture. I've got some very nice furniture here. So I thought, I must have something. And then I thought, you've got all that Beatle memorabilia. Well, not a lot, but some. But I didn't collect things. I'm not a collector. But I've got a friend called Hunter Davies who collects every single thing he can. And his house is full of stuff. But I just threw mine away. Anyway, so I thought, well, I can do that. So I've got all the stuff. I've got letters from John. When he was in New York and I was in London, he wrote to me. And he gave me copies of Imagine, the lyrics. There were copies, very early photostats in those days. It was shiny paper. And he'd written on them where it changed the lyrics, all the songs, all these things. I had all this stuff. And I thought, I could sell that, I suppose. So I thought, I better tell the children first, because they may be upset. They may, say, oh, Dad, you can't do that. So I got all the stuff out one day, and they all came separately. And I said, what do you think? So they got them, and they read them, looked at them, and said, yeah, fine, what else? And that was it. It was no big deal. I said, I'm going to sell them, maybe. Yeah, okay. It was no big deal for them. And I sort of realized then that John was big in my life, but he wasn't big in their lives. So I said to them all. One of them, I think my son Dominic, said, Dad, do you think John saved your letters to him? I said, well, obviously not. I said, well, think about it. So I thought about it. I said, yeah, why would I save it? So I made photocopies and then went to a very posh auctioneer in London, Bonhams or one of those, the Bonhams, and sold them. And we got £2,000 for all this stuff. And among them were John's letters and things. And I didn't make a fortune, but I did okay. And so I forgot about them. And I've never, ever once regretted it because I'm not that kind of fan. I like the songs. I like hearing them, but I'm not interested in bits of paper. Anyway, so roll on till about 5 years ago. And Yoko was in London for something at a reception. I hadn't seen her now in donkey's years. It was for Hunter Davis, my friend again. And we met, and she's across the room, and she saw me, I saw her. And I went across, and she just murmured to me, you sold John's letters. And that was it. And I thought, oh, really? Yeah. I kind of put it to one side. I just thought, well, strange thing. How did she know this? I'd forgotten to tell you that while I was selling them, there was somebody in New York bidding for them. I'd forgotten that bit. Somebody in New York bidding for them, and some in Switzerland. And what they did, they had one guy on the phone here, people on the phone there in the other countries. And they said, I have $10,000 for this, 15 or pounds, whatever. And they go through it, So, and I often thought, who's spending, I think it came to about £30,000 in all for all my stuff. A few letters from John. Maybe I should have hung on to them, but I didn't anyway. I could have got a lot more. Now, I got quite a lot more, but I didn't. But I was quite happy with what I got. Anyway, roll on to about 2 years ago, and that book of Yoko's, Imagine, came out. I bought one and got it. And suddenly I noticed that they've reprinted the lyrics of Imagine. And they aren't John's versions. They're the ones he gave me with his scribbles on them. Exactly.
Oh, wow.
So I realized who'd actually bought the lyrics. It was Yoko who'd bought them through a lawyer. And I went through them all the same ones where he crossed something out and moved this thing to down here, a little arrow, the way you do when you're changing things. And I was kind of amused that Yoko had actually paid me. I think her part of my deal would have been about £20,000. And I think the other 10 or 15 came from other bits and pieces, something from George Harrison, something from Paul McCartney, So that's kind of nice. But anyway, we never spoke again after Sam rang up and slammed the phone down on me and the film was cancelled. And I just thought, well, I've clearly upset her and I didn't mean to. And I probably deserved to a bit because I hadn't really thought it through. I was just trying to find the best way of doing it and I didn't. I found the wrong way. I can only guess that she went to Warner Brothers and said, and there's some argument, We weren't even going to have to use Beatles songs because that can be murder. So I didn't want to get into all that. So it was before they wrote any songs.
Right. It's all pre-Beatles rock and roll covers.
Pre-Beatles would have been all Chet Berry stuff and, whatever.
Right. So I wonder if this would have been in the 80s, which it would have had to have been in Mimi's lifetime. Warner Brothers was the one that did the documentary, the Imagine film, the David Wolper one. I
saw that last week. That may have been the problem. I don't know.
Yeah, the competing project.
I saw that last week because I did a Q&A in a place called Twickenham, which is about 10 miles away from where I live, with a disc jockey interviewing me. And that could have been it, yeah. It hadn't occurred to me until you just said that. I hadn't thought about that. That would have been it.
Yeah.
That would have been a conflict, but it needn't have been.
It needn't have been. No. This is not to demonize Yoko, but once she became aware of the project and then the project was killed, it reminded me of the books that I had sent you that article about. So you can see this as a decades-long pattern.
Yeah, I don't want to demonize her either, at all. She has her view of all those years, and I probably have a slightly different view, in some ways quite a lot different view. I mean, I still get cross when people tell me that Yoko wrote Imagine or co-wrote Imagine, and I say, come on.
Let's talk about that a bit, because for anybody who hasn't heard the previous shows or read your wonderful book, Becoming John Lennon, or the Ray Connolly Beatles Archive, you were there. You were part of the Beatles circle. You interviewed them and did numerous articles, some published, some non-published, going back to the 60s and well into the early 70s. In fact, you told the story on the show before of being around in New York with the Lennons at the time of the concert for Bangladesh. And when that whole thing went down where John took off and you got to be Beatle for a day wearing John's clothes that were left behind in New York. So it's not like you were unfamiliar or didn't have a rapport and a relationship with Yoko. You were in that circle quite tightly. Going back even, you were in Canada in late 1969 when they were staying at Ronnie Hawkins and you'd brought over the lithographs, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you weren't just anybody, just some journalist. You were somebody considered a friend.
I'm not sure I brought the lithographs over. I think a guy from New York had them, and he came down, and I was passing them to John before I signed them.
I knew you were part of the chain somehow.
There was a whole chain. There was Ronnie Hawkins, there was his wife, there was me, and Yoko was not involved. She just watched. She was too important to that, and I'm passing them along. And John was there scribbling away, telling us funny stories about how Neil Aspinall had signed his name for Prince Charles and things like this, you know. Anyway, yes, I was involved.
You were somebody well known to her, and so I can understand that you recognized from your own life experience that when you trade access, you lose a bit of control, and if you were to bring her into the loop, that may not be the story you wanted to tell. Now, the question I have for you, given the time you were working on this and you thought it was a great idea to tell John's story from Liverpool to pre-AMI, now, of course, he was murdered by this time. Was any of your motivation in reaction to the Goldman book, or was this something that you on your own recognized as a great story that should be told?
Well, I didn't like the Goldman book at all. It was awful, as was Goldman's book on Elvis. If Elvis had been black, it would have been a racist book. It mocked country and western people, poor whites. It wasn't so much that. It was just that it was a reaction to the St. John thing, or the John, the wonderful hero, and all these. And it's all nonsense. John was never a martyr. I mean, remember when John died and Yoko says something about he's praying for you to the fans. Well, John never prayed in his life for anything. He didn't pray for the fans. That wasn't John. John had a lot of good qualities, incredibly generous. And he's great to me and funny, very funny, all these things, but he wasn't a saint. But I wanted to get across that actually Mimi wasn't a monster either. Mimi loved him very much. She was worried about his future. She was his guardian and everything. He was very close to her in those days. And I wanted to sort of paint them as they were. John was never a working class hero. Their family weren't poor. Liverpool has got a lot of poor families, but they weren't. They lived in a very nice semi-detached house near a golf course. He went to a very good school. In my generation, very few people went to university. It was 5% of the population. John had worked a bit harder. He would have gone because his people in the quarrymen, one went to Oxford and another one went to another university. So they were bright boys. And John was bright. And Paul is very bright. And Paul lived across the park, John, about a mile and a half away. So the amazing situation of that, or the luck of those two boys finding each other, living a mile and a half from each other, one in a poorer working class area in a council house, and John in a rather further upmarket house in a bit more villagey place.
A house with a name.
Yeah.
Mendips.
Yeah, that's right, Mendips. Yeah, I'd forgotten that. And a nice garden and a garage on the side. There was no car in it, I don't think then, but, there could have been, and a garden. So I just sort of think I wanted to get that across and tell the world that's what it's like. We didn't get the chance. There was a film made about John as a young man, Nowhere Boy, later on.
Yeah. What'd you think of that?
I don't like to criticize other writers. So I don't really want to talk about that.
Okay. We get it. Well, let me ask you this. As you got to know Mimi from your interviews with her in preparation for Working Class Hero, did you pick up on any personality similarities with Yoko? Because that's something other people have commented on.
I mean, she was a controlling sort of person, a controlling woman. Well, she would have been. She couldn't control John. Yoko controlled John, but Mimi never controlled John. But there's something about Mimi. She pretended to be angry and fierce. But it was all pretense. It was pretend angry when he did these stupid things. Did, oh, God, John again. I mean, she was of her age and of her time. So she talked about Yoko, not disparagingly, but, well, she's Japanese, as though it made any difference. Things like that. But I can see why Cynthia was frightened of her, because here's Sin coming along, taking Mimi's darling boy away. And she did think the world of him. I mean, she really did think the world of him, with good cause. He was very, very personable, and he'd often talk about Mimi. She'd often come up in conversation. I didn't talk about my mother in conversation. I didn't say my mum would say that. My mum would say that. John often said, Mimi would say this. So she'd made a big impression on him. She was always there. What's amazing was that when he moved to New York, he never came back to see her once, which I'm just astonished by when I think about it. And he was in New York 10 years, and he never came back to see her. He rang her a lot. Some people say all the time, maybe once a day. Well, I doubt that, but probably quite regularly. But he never came back.
What do you read into that? Because once he got his green card and he got the immigration status sorted out, he traveled all over the world, everywhere but England.
I know, he could have come. I think a bit of him didn't want to come back as a failure, because although we don't see him that way now, it's how you see yourself. And he didn't want to come back to England until he had a #1 hit. That was the other thing. So those 5 years, he didn't want to come back. I kind of imagine that, but I'm still astonished. I don't know what to read into it. I thought about it. Why would you do that? Especially when she's getting old.
And hadn't met Sean?
Yeah, I think he did say, you come over here. And she wouldn't. She was an old lady. She said, no, I don't need all that trouble. It's a long way, all that. He'd have made it so easy for her, but didn't do that. I tell you what I do think. I think that Yoko represented home and mother all in one. He used to call her mother. Mother, you love me. Yeah. And I think that one of the reasons that he left Mei Pang and went back to live with Yoko, I think it was easy because the door was open and he walked back in and it was his own home again with all his own stuff. And it was there. And Yoko's there. And he didn't have to think about anything because Yoko did it all. I mean, Yoko was in effect his manager. She's his wife, his manager, everything. It was all there. And I can kind of understand that. It was easier for him. I'm sure he was very fond of May. I think he was.
And she did do a lot of the day-to-day running of his stuff, but there seemed to be something more that he found in Yoko.
It's a kind of thing about, he'd never really had a home. His home was Mendip's, yeah. And then he moved on and married Cynthia. And then that broke up and he moved to Tittenhurst Park, which is this huge, I mean, I remember in the film, it's this huge place. But he only stayed there for about a year. Then he was off again.
Were you ever at Kenwood?
No, I wasn't at Kenwood. No, I went to Ringo's house just round the corner. I didn't go to John's house. No, didn't. No. I went to Tittenhurst Park a lot. And I mean, it was astonishing that he could spend money and time on it, and then just walk away and never go back. But he had a habit of that, like he walked away from the Beatles and never went back.
Walked away from Julian.
Walked away from Julian. And Julian saw very little of him. So there's a habit there, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a pattern.
He walked away from, I'm thinking, who else there was? The Beatles, Sin. I mean, he treated Sin very, very badly. I mean, terribly, really. She was a lovely woman, you know. She was smashing. But I mean, she clearly wasn't the one for him. But he married her very young. She got pregnant. He married her. Did the decent thing, all these sort of things. He did have a habit of just walking away. I've always thought that the Beatles were like a family. And I always saw Paul as this sort of busy mother who was determined to get ahead and get her boys ahead. And you know, and he's still the same. He never stops work, always doing things. George is the sort of truculent teenager. Oh, no. I remember George Martin said, we did a series together. George said, oh, George is such a whinger. And I thought, yeah, I know what you mean. And Ringo was a kind of happy-go-lucky younger son who just lucky to be there and grateful to be there and just got on with it, But John was this sort of, it could be difficult anyway. So he went back to Yoko, and that's back into something that's solid, the Dakota, the building, everywhere, something he understands. He doesn't have to think, doesn't think about money anymore, because he never cared about money. He was never interested in what he had, what he owned. He didn't even know that in England, the song Imagine had never been a hit single. He didn't know. Everybody else in the world, in Britain, everyone knew that, apart from John Lennon. He hadn't bothered to find out. And he said, oh, really? Must have been. No, it wasn't. It was on an album. In 1975, it was released as a single for the first time.
Right, with Shaved Fish.
But we all knew. He didn't know. Bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, a kind of a detachment towards business in that way, especially for a guy who had a reputation for being competitive to a certain point.
Very competitive, yeah.
Yeah.
But we say he switched off, but he followed the things happening in England all the time. I mean, I've got letters from him saying, you must look very old now you're in the common market and all my pounds are turning into Spaniards and Frenchmen and things. And it's quite a funny letter, but so he followed it from afar. He wasn't involved on a day-to-day basis ever.
Your correspondence from John, did that end up in the Hunter Davies book of letters?
I think one of mine does, although I had to get permission. I think he just assumed permission. There's one of my letters ended up in that John wrote to me, yeah. But, you probably think, how could I sell them? But actually, it was very easy. It really was not that difficult. It's like I've thought about the Get Back film, which we've all watched, And people asked me the other night in the thing in Twickenham, what did I think of it? I said, well, it was very long. I mean, really long, really, really. And they all laughed. And I sort of thought, the difference is the people who really love Get Back and the film, they didn't go to the sessions. They didn't know the Beatles. If you knew them and went to the sessions, or not those sessions, but other sessions, I'd seen them recording or working together or editing or whatever, it wasn't that surprising to see how much time they just spent talking. Or, that's what they did. It's what we all do.
What you said a minute ago about the Beatles situation as being very much like a family, that was one of the things that was very much front and center, I thought, in the Get Back documentary, was the dynamic between them. The great love that they had for each other came out in every frame, but also the sort of dynamics, describing George as the truculent teenager and Paul as the mother hen and all that. I thought that was very apparent.
Wasn't it? I've always felt sorry for Paul. When John left the Beatles, he divorced Paul. That must have been terrible. I've understood it more and more as I've got older, that actually John and Paul were a partnership, a real total partnership, and they helped each other, which you can see in Get Back. When it ended, Paul must have been in a dreadful state because he wasn't sure what he was going to do next. He wasn't sure he could do it. He wasn't sure it would work. He was imagining he was going to end up not very important anymore because he writes as well. I mean, he knew he'd written, for Get Back, he'd written at least 3 great songs, but it would have been hanging over him that maybe that's it. Maybe my career ends with this.
Right. Maybe they don't accept me without John.
Yeah. I just think it was kind of cruel the way John did it, just walked away. But he did it.
And you see that as part of the pattern.
Yeah, sure. He just did it. But then again, you have to say, well, his father just walked away.
And that's the thing. I'm not a psychologist, but when you look at somebody with clear-cut abandonment issues, as he did as a child, both his parents walk away from him. He gets reconnected with his mother, then she gets taken from him. And Stuart Sutcliffe, his uncle George, all these people close to him that nurtured him, that he had a strong relationship with, just one by one are gone. And then you see the pattern of him in his life of the people he cuts off and walks away from, as we described here. It is a pattern, it's a cycle, and it's almost like, given his own background, maybe he couldn't have done anything better or different without getting some kind of major therapy.
He did talk about it a lot. I can remember being in Tittenhurst. You always saw John in his bedroom, by the way. You never saw him anywhere else. So he came up and said, I want to tell you something. We were in his bedroom, and he suddenly said, I've had a lot of death in my life. Just sort of bluntly like that. I've had a lot of death in my life. We were talking about his father, who had come round the weekend before, I think it was. And John had just come back from his time getting prime therapy. And he told his dad he was going to bury him in the middle of the sea or something. quite unpleasant. And you sort of think, why would you do that? I know what it was. It started off me by saying, "That song, Mother, Father, you left me," all that sort of thing, yeah? And I said, "Isn't that a bit tough on your father? Because your dad's still around." His dad was still around. And he said, "Why should I care? He left me. I didn't leave him. He came here last week and I showed him the door." Why? He said, "Well, I couldn't be having it. I've just come back and done all that." And he went away and didn't care about me. I never saw him again until he was washing dishes on the front page of the Daily Express. I think he did soften later on in life and tried to get back with his dad again. It was too late by then. But yeah, you're right. There was a pattern of him walking away from things and just not going back. Although, I'm thinking about that, when he went to New York, I didn't see him for the next few years at all. We did keep in touch. I wrote to him and he wrote to me a few times. I think he wrote to me 3 times. And I've had 2 of the letters, which I sold, and another one, which I lost. If he's stuck behind the mantelpiece and, things get thrown, what's this? Oh, doesn't matter. Things like that, But I still feel sorry for him. I still think that he wouldn't have liked the image he's now got. He wouldn't have liked the saintly image he's now got and all that sort of stuff. But Cynthia used to say he was a bad boy, but he wasn't the worst. She'd always say that, well, he wasn't the worst, And he treated her very badly, but he wasn't the worst. So that's what she reckoned.
The worst in her life or the worst in humanity?
Well, she had another 3 more or 2 more husbands to afterwards. So
husbands or partners, yeah.
So she may have had other troubles. I don't know about that. But it was just that phrase, well, he wasn't the worst. That's a really good northern phrase.
Oh.
You hear that in Liverpool.
Getting back to what you mentioned about why he didn't go back to England and thinking that it might be because he needed to be seen as successful and not a failure. You remind me of, it's only during the period he's away from Yoko and he puts together the Walls and Bridges album and it goes to #1 and has a #1 hit single. That was the first time in his entire solo career that he had that kind of success. Not even Imagine did that. And only then do you start to hear him saying out loud, exploring the possibility of working with Paul again. Paul was doing the Venus and Mars sessions in New Orleans, and he publicly announced he was going to go down there. But he also was talking to May about it. He ran into Art Garfunkel at a party and asked him what it was like working with Paul Simon again, just kind of feeling people out on that. And I was struck by that as like, well, now you've got your #1. You're finally in a level of parity. Was that maybe something that might have kept him from working with Paul prior to that, since they'd sort of mended their relationship for a few years by then? But Paul was having hit after hit in the States, and maybe he didn't want to be seen as the guy that needs help.
Well, yeah, it would have driven John mad to watch Paul hit after hit. I can just see that. I've often thought he didn't think he was as good as people thought he was. It doesn't matter how much praise you get or whatever. You thinking, you thought, well, they're going to find me out one of these days. And I think they did find him out slightly. In that, after Imagine, that album, sometime in New York City, it was terrible, actually. I mean, it just wasn't very good. I think if Paul had been there, they wouldn't have put it out, but they wouldn't have done it. They just said, anyone can do this. Anyone can do that. That's no big deal. I actually did think Woman is the Neighbor of the World. That was kind of interesting. I wouldn't have written that. But I just sort of thought that most of the album, things like that Irish one.
Oh, Luck of the Irish?
Yeah. Come on, John. Those are the sort of things he might have sung in the cabin when he was a bit drunk. If I had the luck of the Irish, that sort of stuff. It's a terrible album. And I think he probably thought he had lost his mojo. And mojo comes from the input of others.
Not from isolation.
Yeah. I think he missed that input because he was quite a social person. He liked to talk. He just loved to talk. And I don't know who he talked to when he was by himself. He liked to talk about whatever was going on. He watched TV all the time and always have an opinion, whatever was happening. And he loved journalists, actually. He did love journalists. So he didn't mind being interviewed. He would be interviewed because he just liked talking.
He talked in headlines.
He did. I've always thought he would have been a very good advertising guy because he had great slogans for things, All you need is love, Imagine. I mean, all these things. That thing about, I was going to say about Imagine, if Yoko co-wrote Imagine, which he said she did, but John lied a lot, or he said what would make her happy. They're not lies, made her happy. But if Yoko wrote Imagine, Ringo Starr wrote Hard Day's Night, because that came from a phrase that is equally valid.
Inspiration is not collaboration.
Yeah. I got a book out, Grapefruit, that Yoko gave me and signed to Ray, love from Yoko, and I read it. And I think 3 times she says, imagine that the moon is shining through a forest on a pool of water. Get a brush and bucket and take the water away. I think something like that. Yeah, well, yeah, that's okay. But, that isn't quite writing Imagine. It's a zany idea, but imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try. Well, there's a thought, yeah.
If she'd been around in 63, maybe he'd credit her with I'll Get You.
Yeah.
Imagine I'm in love with you, it's easy if you try.
Oh, yeah. I'd forgotten that. Yeah. Get you in the end. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I do find myself singing Beatle lyrics. I mean, I very, very rarely play the Beatles, actually, in the house. But I walk around unconsciously singing the song. I think John and Paul wrote this. And I still think that Penny Lane is probably John and Paul at their very best. I think things like that. I think that when they were describing Penny Lane and Eleanor Rigby, when they were that kind of period, when they were describing the world they grew up in.
Strawberry Fields?
Yeah, I think they were very clever. I really do think that. I think, yeah. Eleanor Rigby was like no other song. Now, John told me he wrote half the lyrics or more. Well, that's probably an exaggeration again. He did exaggerate, but he certainly contributed, and they'd spot each other off.
Do you think he ever had the awareness during the post-Beatle years of how much he needed Paul to spark off of?
I'm sure he did. He knew. Whenever you met him, or I didn't see much of him after 72 or something, but whenever you met him, he'd always read my pieces in the Evening Standard. And then he'd comment on them. Paul fixed this. Does Paul really think this? It was bizarre. I mean, he was really interested in what they were doing, what Paul was doing, more than what Ringo and George were doing. He'd see George and he'd see Ringo sometimes, but Paul was kind of always there in the background. It was still a sort of little battle going on, for sure. He certainly missed him. I always think that the sadness was that after they broke up, I think Paul probably has written 10 good songs since then. Is that about right? Is that fair? Did he written more than that?
Like Beatle level evergreens? That's probably in the range, sure.
He's written a lot of songs, but a great many shouldn't have been recorded. But they shouldn't, should they? But maybe 10, maybe a few more, thinking about the fact. And John maybe wrote 4, 5. I don't think more than that. Maybe there were 4 on Plastico and a Band, and maybe John wrote 10 in all, and Paul wrote 20. But they didn't write in the way they'd written before, where it was just coming out of it all the time. Wonderful songs and clever songs. Or maybe you get to 30 and you can't do it the same anymore. Maybe that's the other thing. Maybe like Mozart. Mozart died, so he didn't have to bother. Paul has gone on, still makes albums all the time. And they go to number 1 because he sells them so heavily, and he goes on every TV show and in every paper and everything. And for a week they're at number 1, and then they're number 100 the week after because all the fans go and buy them, and then that's it. And do they ever play them again? Do you ever play Paul's new albums?
Oh, no. I never hear them on the radio, but maybe the first couple months they're out, and that's it.
Yeah. I bought every single thing he's done out of loyalty, and I always play them once. Say, that's okay. Yeah, so that reminds me of, that's okay. What's next? And that's it. I never play them again. There were a couple recently, and I thought, people aren't listening. That's quite a good song. There was one about, I forget what they call it. I forget the call, so that just shows how important it's been. But, and you think, that would be good. And then they've gone. And it must drive him mad to think that he could want to write songs so effortlessly, it seemed. The world knew them. All the world knew Paul's songs. In Get Back, in the film, he comes up with Get Back, Along a Winding Road, Let It Be, which I'd actually heard the previous November when they were finishing the White Album. He'd written it then, and it was too late for that, so he used it on the next album. But when he could write those effortlessly, and now he just couldn't get a hit to save his life. That can't be good, can it?
Well, the landscape has totally changed how people digest music. It's not the way it was, and I think he's still stuck in that mentality, and I don't think anybody can be a rock star anymore. It's not even possible. It's a whole different world. So the fans will always be there that'll pick up anything and see him on tour when they can, although that's getting more and more difficult because prices are outrageous. and some of his most loyal fans just can't do it anymore. Have you seen him in person or crossed paths with him anytime recently?
No. He did me a favor. When I wrote my book on Elvis about 5 years ago, the publisher, I didn't do it. The publisher went to him in New York and said, will you give me a quote put on the front of the book? He did. Whether he ever read it, I doubt very much. But I would never have asked him. I'd never have asked him.
Have you seen his lyrics book that came out last year?
Yeah, I've got it.
Okay. Any impressions on it?
My biggest impression is I've not really read it. There was one that he missed out on from his first McCartney album that I was really surprised he hadn't got it on. It was that one about every night I just want to stay in. Every night, yeah. That's not in the book. That's a great song. And that would have been a great Beatles song. But what I always want to do is, I should get around to it one day, is putting together the best songs on the first album that Paul, John, George, maybe Ringo did as one album. And sort of, this was the thing they would have done next, you know? But a great album, wouldn't it? John singing Mother or whatever. And I don't believe in Beatles, that one, yeah? And you could end on that. And then
God, yeah.
I've never done it.
During the period when they were actually working on the Get Back project and being filmed, were you around for any of that?
I didn't go. The only thing I know is that I knew they were doing it, and it was a close set, and I was doing other stuff all the time. And so I didn't go and didn't ask to go. And then I got a call one morning from the Evening Standard, and there were people queuing up. There were mobs outside Apple in Savile Row, and the Beatles were on the roof making a record. And so people were ringing me and say, I'm outside Apple, there's a terrible noise up there, all that sort of stuff. And so that was the front page lead that day in the Evening Standard. What I remember about all that, though, was that after it, John talked about it. And as I said, he exaggerated. And according to him, they were the worst fucking sessions ever. And it went on and on, you know, in his way. Because John, he didn't really mean that. It meant he hadn't enjoyed it very much. That's what you and I would have said. But to John, it's the worst. And he was gone. And no one could have enjoyed it. It was how terrible it was. And I kind of think that sort of image stuck a bit. I mean, clearly he hadn't enjoyed it.
Do you think that was because of the film? Because of the Let It Be film that everybody looks at as all downbeat?
Well, he was saying this before it came out. He was saying to me before the film was finished, because I said, what's happening? He said, oh, they're still cutting it off.
That's very interesting that before he saw the film, because there's a perception that a lot of their memories are colored by seeing the Let It Be film. And now Peter Jackson reveals plenty of lightness and levity and productivity and fun that seems to have completely escaped their memories.
Yeah, well, in John's case, you look at the worst side of it. And I think the worst side was stuck in Twickenham, actually. Well, they were in Twickenham Studios. And it wasn't a recording space. And they put it all together when they came back to Apple and did it in the basement there. But he did moan about it a lot, how awful it had been, terrible it had been. And it clearly wasn't that bad. But then again, maybe Peter Jackson put together the happier moments because Paul wanted it to be done. You're sort of wondering whether the first verse was accurate or maybe the second verse was accurate. You don't know now because you've got two different slants. Using similar material, Peter Jackson gave us, I think, 3.5 hours, where the first version is only 85 minutes or something.
Yeah, it's 85 minutes versus like almost 8 hours.
8 hours, really?
Yeah, between the 3 parts all spread out, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, he says he's restored everything, and if they ever allow him, he'd be happy to put more of it out.
Yeah.
Were you aware of John's heroin use at the time?
No, I didn't know. He did say 2 things. Once I went to see him, and Yoko was in hospital, and she lost the baby. Michael X, who was really an English gangster, really. He wasn't a very nice guy. And John got involved with him. His real name was Michael Abdul Malik, and he was from Trinidad. And he was trying to rebuild his image as a good guy. And he got hold of a house and called the Black House. And he was going to do great things for the black population of London. I don't think he ever did. But Michael turned up that day with a mate with a big suitcase. And he opened it. This is in a hospital, in a private hospital. He opened it and he had a big bag of marijuana. And even John was surprised. I've never forgotten just thinking, fucking hell. But then Michael went and I stayed and we were talking about, I think John offered me a job that day and I didn't want to take the job. So I didn't like to say that because I didn't want to upset him, or I just thought, I'm not sure about this. with a wife and children.
What was the job?
I think it was probably to run around after them, promoting them.
Some kind of a PR guy?
Kind of, or fixer, or whatever.
Oh, okay.
Because I fixed for him to go on the Michael Parkinson show, because I was kind of working on it at the same time. And the reason he was on that was because they asked me if I had any ideas. I said, well, I can get you John Lennon if you want. And they sort of said, oh, well, I don't know. But they were frightened that, I mean, it's a great idea for Mike Parkinson. That's a great idea. But then the producer said, yeah, but maybe he'll take all his clothes off, and so will she in the studio, and we won't know what to do. I said, they're not going to do that. He's a funny man. Are you sure? Well, he won't go on about it. I said, no, if you come on here, it'll be funny, because that's what John is. He's a performer. It'll make you laugh. And of course he did.
The British press actually called Yoko ugly in the papers, and I've never seen that about any woman or man. Even if a person is ugly, you don't normally sort of say it in the paper, that ugly woman, and she's not ugly. And if she was, you wouldn't be so mean. They even say attractive about the most awful looking people, just to be kind.
At the end of the show, I remember Mike Parkinson saying, well, it's been great meeting you, John. We'll have you back next time for longer. John said, yeah, well, maybe. Of course, John had left England like the week after, never came back. So big miss there. But I forgot what I was saying. What was I saying?
Oh, you're talking about Michael X.
Michael X, yeah. Oh, that's right. And anyway, a nurse comes in and she's going to give Yoko something because Yoko's in bed. And John suddenly said, don't give her that. She's a junkie, And I don't know what she was going to give her.
Some kind of opioid, maybe?
I don't know. I have no idea. She was going to give her something to calm her down or make her go to sleep or whatever. I don't know whatever she did. I have no idea. But at the first time I'd heard that word, now later on, a bit later, when he did cold turkey, after cold turkey, he was just sort of talking generally. He wouldn't sort of say, he said, I'm not saying what drugs, because if I do, I'll get into all kinds of, I'll have everybody onto me. I'm not going to tell you what drug I'm talking about. And I got the idea that, yeah, it was something heavy, but he never let me know. And I think he probably thought I was a bit of an old fuddy-duddy. And he'd think, I'm not telling Ray because he won't get it. And I wouldn't. There were things that I suppose, in a way, he'd be more comfortable talking about drugs to other people than me. I mean, he wouldn't.
You might feel judged.
He would think that. And I probably would. I'd have thought you soft player. You don't want to do that. Or why are you doing that? So there were sides of him. I mean, maybe he would have thought I was a nice middle-class boy that wouldn't do that sort of thing. I wasn't a rocker. I had a proper job.
You were a family man. You were a straight, maybe, to John.
I'd be a straight, yeah. I would be straight to an extent. I'll never forget in upstate New York, Syracuse, and Phil Spector had taken some girl up on the plane with us that morning. We'd gone from New York to Syracuse. And the girl was way out of it. She was floating. And I think everyone was slightly embarrassed that there were sort of several people on that thing. May was certainly there. I was there. Yoko's sister was there, and her boyfriend was there. And I think Laurie from Apple was there. So, a lot of people. And we all sort of looked at each other and didn't say anything, And later on that afternoon, John's birthday, and I'm going down the corridor to get some cigarettes. And on the way back, there were all these heavies that worked for Phil Spector, who were sort of kind of like guards or whatever, looking after him. And one of them came out of the room and he looked at me, and when you're with someone like John, the people who work for him are always nice to you. They just are. If you're a friend of his, they are friends of yours. And I've noticed that this in several situations. But one of them comes out and he said, hey, Ray, we're all fucking that girl that Phil brought up with her. You want to have a go? And I, what? I was a bit shocked. And I said, no, thank you. No. I went back into the room where John is with all these people getting a birthday cake or something. And there were quite a few people turned up. And I went around and sat and said, the girl Spector brought up? I said, yeah. I said, well, some of those guys, roadies or whatever they were, they're having it off with her in one of the rooms, in one of the bedrooms. He just said, really? Don't tell Yoko. So I didn't. But then the next morning, we're somewhere else together, and he said, tell me again what happened. So I told him what happened. I just told you. He just said, don't tell Yoko. So he was kind of, in a way, protecting her from the seedy side of Spector. Spector was quite a seedy guy. I never liked him, because he was very clever. But anyway, I don't know why I told you that, but I think I've told you before anyway, haven't I?
No, I don't remember that. I've never heard that story before.
Oh, well, there you are.
I just think, well, I wonder if John was just frightened of how she would react.
I think she was feminist enough to have sort of said, God's sake. Even at that stage, she'd have been sort of saying, for heaven's sake, we don't want this. In Syracuse, it was a sort of exhibition to promote her work. And that was not the sort of thing that she wanted to be promoting, so she wouldn't have liked that. And he was embarrassed too. It was kind of horrible because, the girl was, I assumed that she was a hooker and that she was being paid for the trip, but you don't treat people like that. It was horrible. And I've often thought, well, what happened to that girl later on? Even that day, did she fly back by herself? Did they bother about where she was going to get back? All those sort of things. There were always sort of a few seedy people around Spectre.
So the way it played out was no surprise.
No, but dreadful though, yeah. You sort of think of that poor girl. Terrible, terrible story. Well, the Michael X story. Did I tell you that? The guy
you started to talk about when Yoko was in the hospital, but how that played out was, of course, the murder he was convicted of.
He wasn't convicted of that murder. 2 people who died. The way it is in Trinidad, wherever it was, I think it's Trinidad, he's convicted of the first one, and they didn't even bother trying for the second one. They hanged him. But I know John did try and stop the death sentence.
So he was fully aware of it?
He was aware. It was in the papers here a lot and everything. And by then John was in New York, but he was following it. And they appealed for clemency, him and Yoko appealed for clemency. But the guy didn't get it. Then again, we don't know what his life had been like. He was a nasty bit of work. He really was. He wasn't a nice guy. And the girl, I knew the girl. She came to me in the Evening Standard once, and I was in the Evening Standard. This girl turns up and wouldn't leave. He was a friend of Malcolm X, or relation to Malcolm X. And she was the daughter who'd been to the French lycée, educated at the French lycée, which is a very posh school in London, where they teach her in French. And her dad was a Conservative MP, Gaylan Benson, the name was, and she got involved with this guy, Jamal. Do you know the name, Hakim Jamal?
Yeah.
Anyway, she got involved with him and wanted me to interview him. And I'd just done James Baldwin. I'm thinking, well, it's just another author that no one's ever heard of. James Baldwin, we all know. Hakim Jamal, no one knows. So I'm working for a London evening paper. People have to be able to respond to who you're talking about. If I'm going to give them a whole page, I've got to know who they are and more about them. And that's a really good story. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, Hakim Jamal rang me at home. I only assumed he got my number from John Lennon and rang me at home and said, why aren't you going to interview me? I said, well, I'm not sure. And then he suddenly went into a rant, at the end of which he said, I am God. And I thought, well, no way I'm going to interview you now. That's never going to happen. So that was that. And then the next thing I heard, I was coming back from Liverpool, actually, or from Lancashire. We bought a paper at the service station. We read that Michael X was in Trinidad and had done a runner, and that Gaylan Benson was dead. This poor girl who'd been sitting on my desk a year earlier, being a bit of a pain. It was a bizarre time,
You're reminding me of that other cause that they took up for a time, John and Yoko of Hanratty.
Yeah, another one. That was a sad story.
Who was hanged, and they were trying to get justice or get that overturned, right?
Yeah, and he probably did it,
Yeah, I thought DNA ultimately decided that he did.
In a way, I kind of like that, the fact that they were taking up causes without really investigating them. That was foolish, and no journalist would do it without investigating. But they would believe what they were told, and it fitted in with the way they wanted to see the world, and that this man had been hanged wrongly. It was a very famous murder case, that was, the A4 murder case in 1970 or something.
Early 60s, I think, right?
Was it? I can't remember.
Yeah, because it was all settled by the time Yoko was on stage at the Lyceum for that concert in December 69.
Britain! You killed Hanratty, you murder! You killed Hanratty!
Do you remember that?
That's right, yeah. When we went to Canada, there were things, they stuck up these things in Bonnie Hawkins' house about Hanratty is innocent. And people, who the hell is Hanratty? In Canada, no one knew about Hanratty. But poor man. There's another guy called Peter Alphonse who was involved, but he wasn't involved. I mean, he didn't do it. Hanratty did it. But John would have crazes. And this was a craze. And he went through lots of crazes in his life. Feminism was a craze. And people say, oh, no, but it was a craze. And he got bored with it. They kept saying, Yoko and John, oh, well, we're great feminists. Well, actually, May Pang would tell a different story. She wasn't treated very well. Yoko found her as a concubine, basically, and said, look after John. And it was a job. The girl fell in love with him.
It doesn't sound like the actions of a feminist.
Not really, does it? Not really. No. But, May's a lovely woman.
Do you know about the documentary they just made?
I've not seen it, but I know she has. I've read about it.
The Lost Weekend, a love story.
Yeah. But John did stay in touch with her, That's always hushed up. But, they did stay in touch. And he would see her now and again, And he did have plans, according to May, and I'm sure it's true, to actually see her later when the album came out. So in a way, he kept in touch with her, which he didn't with most people. So that tells you something, I think.
And you, right up until literally his last day, were in touch with him.
Well, for a long time, I wasn't. For about 5 years, I was doing other stuff. I didn't make any effort to stay in touch with him.
Mm-hmm. So they reached out to you?
Peter Brown came to London in 1980. Peter Brown used to work for Apple. I was always very friendly with Peter. And he's now living in New York. And we had lunch together. And we got talking. And he was telling me what John and Yoko were up to. And then he said, are you still in touch with them? And I said, no, I haven't been in touch. I haven't got the phone number, I don't think, anymore. He said, I'll give you the phone number. And quickly just wrote down the phone number. He gave it to me, a piece of paper. So that was in the summer. And then in the autumn, I began reading that he just done a new album, gone into the studio. And so I'd moved house, I think. And anyway, so I rang up and I got Yoko. And we had a chat. And she said, well, I thought I'd come and interview. She said, well, maybe, yeah, okay. Well, not now, though. We'll let you know when. So, okay. So I called again in about 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks later. And I got the same response. And I could never get through to John. And I'd heard since that she would block people off. And so okay. And I didn't bother. I thought, oh, forget it. So the weeks go by. And suddenly she rang me. And she said, where are you? We thought you were coming. This is now December, or whatever it was, 8th, 7th, 8th. And I said, well, I thought you weren't interested. She said, oh, yeah. John's waiting for you to come over. He's talking about it. Apparently, he'd been telling the BBC that Ray Connolly's coming over to talk to him. And I said, well, I'll come tomorrow if you like. And yes, come tomorrow. It's very urgent. You must come very soon. It's very urgent. But that's Yoko. I mean, I told the Sunday Times for whom I was writing then, and said, I can get you John Lennon for the back page, which was a big interview then. Great. It was quite a night because the children, my kids were then about 13, 11, 9, and we were all playing the new album because I thought I'd better listen to this new album. And I called John that night before I went to bed, and I got someone who worked there, who I forgot what the name was, but I'd been told who it was, but I'd forgotten. So they said, oh, John's looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Come straight over to the Dakota when you get in. Don't hang around, just come straight here. John's waiting for you. I said, okay. So I said the flight's in at whatever it was, like 1 o'clock or something from London. So I said, I'll be there in mid-afternoon. Okay. And that was it. And they said, oh, John's not here right now. He's gone down to the studio to remix a track with one of Yoko's tracks. I said, okay, well, see you tomorrow then. Bye, good night. Went to bed, went to sleep. There's going to be a cab going to take me to the airport in the morning. Went to bed. 4:30, the phone goes. It's a guy on the Daily Mail for some reason. He had my number. And he said, we just heard that John Lennon's been shot. And I thought it was a tactic to take me to the airport. I said, no, sorry, what? I'm asleep. What? I think it's too early. And he said, no, John Lennon's been shot in New York. And I said, oh, well, I've got to go and see him this afternoon on the way. Is he hurt? He said, I don't know. I've just been working from a New York office telling me that. So I'm lying in bed with Plum, my wife, and John's been shot. But we didn't know how bad it was. I got up and went downstairs and turned on the radio. In those days, BBC didn't do a 24-hour news service, so it was going to be on. They had a foreign world service, BBC World Service, you could hear it all around the world. And at 5 o'clock, the headline came on, John Lennon is dead. And I sort of just listened in total amazement. Went back upstairs and told Plum, and I'd made a cup of tea by this time, and we both sat there. and didn't know what to do. And then at about 8 o'clock, 7:30, the Eden Standard, my old paper, right. And I said, I know what you want. And they said, 1,000 words, 8 o'clock? I said, yeah, I can do that. Well, it was 8:30. Yeah. And so I sat down and began to write the obituary. John had said to me donkey's years earlier, have you written my obituary? Yeah, I'd like to see it when you have. I hadn't written it then. Of course I hadn't written it. There's only 30 when he told me. And my children came, when they came down, been excited the night before, Dad's going to go and see John Lennon. And suddenly they come down and I'm writing John's obituary and they've heard that he's dead. So it was an amazing night for them. That Dad's going to go and see John tomorrow. In the morning, he's writing his obituary. And then I spent the rest of the day either writing about it for other papers, other journals I wrote for everybody, or on the radio. I did lots of radio things too. And didn't go to New York. And then Yoko rang up just after Christmas, really angry with me that I hadn't gone to New York. And she said, I know, you don't worry about the poor widow. It's only John you really cared about. I said, John, I would never have got in. There were so many people outside. I saw it on television, thousands of people. Yes, you would have got in. Ringo got in. I'm not Ringo. I wouldn't have got in. That was the story about how John died. Yeah.
That's something.
Yeah. It was a sad day. And I've often thought it's over 40 years ago. He only had half a life. And I've been lucky. I've had a full life. And we're the same age. Maybe that's why we got on so well. And we had the same points of reference, the same kind of education. No father, either of us. All these things.
Did you get into skiffle?
No, actually. I mean, I know all the records they liked and everything. I never played anything. I couldn't play Rock Island Line, Lonnie Donegan. I wasn't really turned on to anything until I heard Elvis. That made a huge difference. And I never quite saw what people saw in skiffle. I know what they saw because you could all do it. It was very, very easy to do. I didn't know people that had guitars. I didn't know anything like that. I mean, I had a sort of quietly middle-class upbringing where people didn't have guitars at my school or didn't do things like that. So I'd be the expert on rock and roll. And you'd listen to the American radio stations on AFN, American Forces Network in Germany. So you hear things ahead of everybody else. That was really exciting. I'm sure John would listen to those things too, in his bedroom in Mendips. I wasn't into skiffle, no.
It's interesting. It's always good for me to get the perspectives of people that were there, how it affected them or didn't affect them.
John was in a big city. That made a difference. I mean, he was not in it, but he wasn't that far from a big city. And those at his school would have been cooler, more cool, because they were in a city. I was in a town, and certainly I didn't know people who played in bands. Never did. You know how people get an image of you. Years later, I went back to a school. I live in a small town called Ormskirk, which is tiny in Lancashire. And some guy said, do you still play the saxophone? I said, what? He said, saxophone. I don't play a saxophone, never. And he said, have you forgotten? You used to be in a band playing the saxophone. I never did. In the end, I said, oh, yeah, that band. Oh, yeah, I'd forgotten that, yeah. Because it was too hard to argue with him. He just went on and on and on. You sort of, well, if that's what you want to remember, it was somebody else.
Did you ever see the book Billy Bragg wrote a few years ago on skiffle?
No.
Oh, it's really, really good. And one of the things he talked about in there, he's sort of trying to explain how revolutionary this all was. He did the research, and the end of rationing in Britain happened in July 1954, the very same month that Bonnie Donegan recorded Rock Island Line and Elvis recorded That's All Right Mama. And all these events just sort of converged in a perfect storm of timing where kids in Britain suddenly had the money to spend on luxuries like that. And skiffle was empowering. If you wanted to be part of a fun group thing and you didn't have any talent, that was okay. And then Rock Around the Clock and all these things converged and it became the thing. He likened skiffle to fidget spinners, is this ubiquitous thing among kids in Britain that it didn't matter. And for some people it stuck and they went on to take it further, and other people it was just a fad of the moment and it got put aside. So that was a fascinating read.
Yeah. The other thing about that was that they changed the rules on hire purchase. And it meant that they changed it to help people buy refrigerators and washing machines. And that they changed the rules so electric goods could be bought, but they could also buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars. And they changed the rules so electric goods could be bought, but they could also buy guitars on hire purchase, but they could also buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire purchase, which actually made it possible to buy guitars on hire to go and buy a guitar and pay £1 down and £1 next month or whatever. And that made a hell of a difference. So all these things, they all fit into a pattern. Nothing happens by itself. There's a reason for everything.
It was like the perfect storm.
And some people are able to take advantage of it for one way or another, and some just enjoy it.
So any final thoughts on Get Back? Was there anything you saw, to the extent, however much of it that you saw, that reminded you of something, or you were able to see with fresh eyes that made you look at things differently?
Only that it was a happier memory than the one John had painted for me. It seemed more pleasant. But also, as a filmmaker myself, I've often thought, well, what don't we know? Is this a very kind cut? And that struck me. But I did love the bit where Paul starts off doing Get Back. I mean, that's a great moment. It's like lightning is striking. Ding, 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 ding. And eventually he gets there finally, you know. That's good. And the bit where he's playing Let It Be and the others are listening, you know, and I thought, yeah. And he hadn't quite finished it. And it's been in his mind for some time. By then, it had been in his mind for at least 6 or 7 weeks.
Yeah, at least since the White Album.
Yeah, it's the White Album. Things like that. I suppose it's almost sacrilegious, isn't it, to sort of say, well, I got kind of bored. But I did a bit, you know. But also, it's because I knew what they were like. I didn't need to see that. I knew that's what it was like.
And that's the reaction I seem to get from people who were there. I've had Kevin Harrington on the show and other people that were around. If you were there, it was almost redundant. If you're a Beatle fan from afar, you can't get enough of it.
No, I know. I can understand that. But if you were there and around, and funnily enough, I've not talked to many people about it. Gary Crowley, who's a disc jockey who interviewed me last week on Twickenham, he keeps watching it over and over again. And I'm thinking, why? But, you know, he wasn't there.
Right. I can tell you that for how many times I've seen it, and I'll spend months not seeing it and then come back to it. You get all kinds of emotions triggered by watching it.
Yeah.
So I guess we're not all crazy. Not just me.
I don't think you're that crazy. Slightly crazy, maybe. I don't know. In a way, what I did feel was how sad it was. I always thought it was a good idea that they broke up. At the time, I didn't. It was a terrible idea. But in retrospect, I thought, well, John did the right thing, because otherwise it'd been like the Rolling Stones still going around, where there are sort of pantomime, where people go and watch them, because I've seen the Rolling Stones. Haven't made a good record in 30 years, probably. So that would have been a tragedy. And the idea that you sort of cut them off and say, that's it, there are no more Beatles, that turned out to be a brilliant, brilliant thing. Because if they'd gone on making, about one album, they could have made one more, so great songs, but it would have gone down, 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 down until they say, oh, another Beatle album. Oh, yes, all right. You know, a bit like we do with Paul's records, sadly. So in a way, by freezing them at their peak, he's kept them going forever. But on the other hand, I've always thought, wouldn't it be great if they'd done something else as well as got together and written a musical, something like South Pacific or West Side Story or something, and used their obvious extraordinary talent for songwriting in something else apart from a rock and roll record? And they could have done. And I know Paul's now trying to do It's a Wonderful Life. I don't know whether it'll work or not. I don't know whether he still has the knack to write fantastic little songs. But at some point, it would have been wonderful to take his ability to write melody and John to have clever ideas. John had clever ideas together and do something else, you know, make it bigger. So what they are now is the Beatles. Great. But wouldn't it have been great if and they also did this and this and this in later life? But they didn't. Paul went back to doing what he's always done, the same thing. John disappeared virtually. Yeah?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Yeah. I've always thought that was sort of something kind of missed, because they weren't as good with other people or without each other. They just weren't. And Paul knew that. John knew that. We all know it.
In a way, they're failing to measure up to Beatles on their own, serve to elevate the Beatles.
Yes, yeah, it does. And also, they behaved quite badly towards, I mean, Paul didn't, but John did, towards George Martin, who was extraordinarily important in going from Please Please Me to Revolver. Without George Martin, they couldn't have made that leap. And they would, because they did everything there was to know about rock and roll. They certainly did that, but nothing else. And he knew everything else, but he didn't know anything about rock and roll. Together, and you have combustion.
The perfect synergy.
Yeah, but that's luck. John meeting Paul was fantastic luck. Then meeting George Martin, incredible luck. And then they break up. Bingo.
It's a great story.
Yeah. We were lucky to be involved.
Oh, yes.
I was certainly lucky.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song performed by the Corgis. Something About the Beatles is an evergreen podcast.